There comes a moment in every man's life when the world decides he's too old to matter. For 106-year-old Ezekiel Carter, that moment came when he rode back into Millbrook, Kansas, and saw the smirks on the faces of men who could have been his great-grandsons. The town's only barn had burned down, and winter was coming fast. Without shelter for the livestock, families would lose everything they'd worked for. That's when Zeke made his promise. He'd rebuild that barn in 7 days. The younger men laughed and placed bets on how quickly the old fool would quit. They saw a broken-down relic clinging to outdated ways. They didn't see the hands that had built half the frontier or the heart that had never learned to surrender. But what secret did this weathered cowboy carry that would silence an entire town? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Millbrook, Kansas, painting the weathered storefronts in shades of amber and gold. It was the kind of light that made everything look older than it was, which suited the town just fine. Millbrook had been aging ungracefully for the better part of 2 decades, ever since the railroad had chosen to bypass it in favor of the larger settlement 30 miles east. What had once been a thriving cattle town now wore the resigned expression of a place that had learned to make do with less. The fire had started sometime after midnight, when most folks were deep in their beds, dreaming of better times, or at least easier ones. By the time the volunteer fire brigade had roused themselves and hauled their equipment to the scene, the barn that had stood at the heart of the community for 30 years was nothing more than a skeleton of charred beams reaching toward the star-filled sky, like the ribs of some prehistoric beast. Now, as the sun climbed higher, the townspeople gathered in small clusters around the smoldering ruins, their faces etched with the kind of quiet desperation that comes when you realize winter doesn't care about your problems. The barn hadn't just been a building, it had been their lifeline, the place where the community stored hay for the harsh months ahead, where livestock could find shelter from the brutal prairie winds, where neighbors came together to help one another survive. Mayor Thompson, a portly man whose mustache had gone completely white in the 5 years since his election, stood at the edge of the crowd with his hands clasped behind his back. He was the kind of man who measured his words carefully, understanding that in a town this size, everything you said would be repeated at least 3 times before supper. "We'll figure something out," he kept saying to anyone who'd listen, but his voice carried the hollow ring of a man who was fresh out of ideas. Sarah Mitchell stood apart from the main group, her arms wrapped around herself despite the warming day. At 35, she was still young enough to remember when hope had been as natural as breathing, but 5 years of widowhood had taught her to temper her expectations. Her husband had been killed in a farming accident, leaving her with a small homestead and a determination to prove that a woman could make it on her own in a world that seemed designed to convince her otherwise. She watched the smoke rise from the ruins and calculated how many cattle she might lose without proper shelter. How many seasons of careful saving might be wiped away by a single harsh winter? The sound of hoofbeats on the hard-packed dirt drew everyone's attention to the eastern edge of town, where a lone rider approached at the steady, unhurried pace of someone who had long ago learned that rushing rarely solved anything. Even from a distance, there was something about the way the man sat his horse that suggested decades of experience, a comfort in the saddle that spoke of countless miles traveled and countless sunsets witnessed from horseback. As the rider drew closer, the older residents of Millbrook began to murmur among themselves. There was something familiar about the set of those shoulders, the way the man's weathered hands held the reins with quiet confidence. But it was impossible the man they were thinking of would be over 100 years old by now, and besides, he'd left town 20 years ago and never looked back. When Ezekiel Carter finally reined in his horse at the edge of the crowd, the silence that fell over the gathering was the kind that comes when people aren't sure whether they're looking at a ghost or a miracle. He was older than anyone had a right to be, his face mapped with lines that told the story of a century of living, but his eyes were clear and sharp as winter sky. He wore the same kind of clothes he'd always worn, simple work pants, a shirt that had seen better days but was clean and mended, and a pair of boots that had walked more miles than most people would travel in a lifetime. On his belt hung a pair of silver spurs, worn smooth by decades of use, their gentle chiming, the only sound as he dismounted with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to respect the limitations of an ancient body while refusing to surrender to them. The spurs had been his father's, and his father's before that, passed down through generations of men who had lived by the code of the frontier. Work hard, keep your word, and never let anyone tell you that something can't be done. Jake Morrison was the first to find his voice, though it came out as more of a croak than the confident challenge he'd intended. At 42, Jake considered himself the unofficial leader of the younger generation, the voice of progress in a town that seemed determined to cling to the past. He owned the largest ranch in the area and had strong opinions about the way things should be done. Opinions that rarely included consulting with people who remembered when the town was nothing more than a trading post and a prayer. "Well, I'll be damned," Jake said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "Ezekiel Carter, thought you were dead." Zeke removed his hat, revealing a head of white hair that still showed traces of the sandy brown it had been in his prime. "Reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated," he said, his voice carrying the dry humor that the older residents remembered. "Though I'll admit, some mornings I'm not entirely sure myself." The crowd chuckled nervously, uncertain how to respond to the return of a man who had become something of a legend in his absence. Stories had grown around Zeke Carter like moss on a stone, each telling adding another layer until it was impossible to separate fact from fiction. Some said he'd built half the barns in 3 counties before he'd turned 40. Others claimed he could raise a frame in a single day that would stand for decades. All anyone knew for certain was that he'd been the best at what he did, and then one day he'd simply vanished. Sarah found herself studying his face, looking for clues to the man beneath the legend. There was something in his eyes that spoke of loss, a weight that hadn't been there in the stories people told about his younger days. She'd heard whispers about a personal tragedy, something that had driven him away from the life he'd built, but the details had been lost to time and the natural reluctance of frontier people to pry into private pain. "Heard you had some trouble here," Zeke said, nodding toward the ruins of the barn. He walked over to examine the damage, his movements deliberate and purposeful. He knelt beside one of the charred beams, running his fingers along the blackened wood with the practiced touch of someone who could read the story of a building's construction in its remains. "Fire started in the loft," he observed, his voice matter-of-fact. "Probably lightning from that storm we had last week. Wood was dry, went up fast." He stood slowly, brushing the soot from his hands. "This was good work, though. Whoever built this knew what they were doing." Mayor Thompson cleared his throat. "Matter of fact, Zeke, that was one of yours. You built that barn about 30 years ago, right before." He stopped himself, remembering too late that there were some subjects that were better left alone. "Before I left," Zeke finished quietly, "I remember." The silence stretched uncomfortably until Jake Morrison decided to fill it with his own brand of practical pessimism. "Well, it's gone now," he said, his voice carrying the tone of someone who prided himself on facing facts squarely. "And winter's coming on fast. We need to figure out what we're going to do about shelter for the livestock, and we need to figure it out quick." "Already talked to the lumber company over in Dodge," said Pete Henley, a rancher whose optimism had been ground down by years of bad weather and worse luck. "They can have materials here in 2 weeks, maybe 3. Course, that's if we can come up with the money and if they don't get a better offer from someone else." 3 weeks? Sarah spoke up for the first time, her voice tight with concern. "The almanac says we're due for an early freeze this year. 3 weeks might be too late." Jake nodded grimly. "That's what I'm thinking. Might be we need to start making arrangements to move the cattle east, find someone who can board them through the winter. Won't be cheap, but it's better than losing the whole herd." The murmur of agreement that rippled through the crowd was the sound of people resigned to making the best of a bad situation. It was the kind of compromise that had become all too familiar in Millbrook, the gradual acceptance that they were no longer capable of solving their own problems. That's when Zeke Carter cleared his throat and said the words that would be remembered long after the last person who heard them had passed on to whatever reward awaited frontier folk who'd spent their lives fighting the prairie. For the right to call it home. "I'll build you a new barn," he said simply. "Have it ready in 7 days." The laughter started as a nervous chuckle from somewhere in the crowd, but it spread quickly, feeding on itself until it became the kind of laughter that people use to convince themselves that what they've just heard is too ridiculous to take seriously. Even the children seemed to understand that something absurd had just been proposed, though they couldn't quite put their finger on what it was. Jake Morrison's laugh was the loudest, a harsh sound that cut through the others like a blade. 7 days, he repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. "You're talking about building a barn in 7 days. Hell, Zeke, you're over 100 years old. Most days I'm surprised you can still get on a horse." "I'm 106, Zeke said calmly, "and I can still get on a horse just fine, thank you. Even if you were 40 years younger," Jake continued, warming to his theme, "you couldn't build a barn in 7 days. Not a proper one, anyway. You'd need a crew, materials, equipment." "I know what I'd need," Zeke interrupted, his voice still calm, but carrying an edge of steel that made several people take a step back. "And I know what I can do." The crowd fell silent again, but this time it was the silence of people watching a confrontation unfold, the kind of tension that builds before a storm breaks. Jake Morrison found himself in the uncomfortable position of having pushed things further than he'd intended, but his pride wouldn't let him back down now. "Tell you what, old man," Jake said, his voice carrying the false heartiness of someone trying to turn a serious moment into a joke. "I'll make you a bet. If you can build a real barn, not some ramshackle shed in 7 days, I'll eat my hat. And if you can't, you admit that it's time to leave the real work to people who still have the strength for it." Zeke studied Jake's face for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded slowly. "Fair enough," he said, "but I'll need to start tomorrow. Sun's getting low today, and I'm not as young as I used to be." The crowd began to disperse, people shaking their heads and muttering among themselves about the foolishness of old men who couldn't accept their limitations. But Sarah Mitchell lingered, drawn by something in Zeke's manner that suggested he might be more serious than anyone realized. "Mr. Carter," she said quietly, approaching him as he examined the ruins one more time, "do you really think you can do it?" Zeke looked at her for a long moment, his weathered face creased with what might have been a smile. "Young lady," he said, "I've been building things since before your grandfather was born. I've seen towns rise from nothing but hope and hard work, and I've seen them fall because people forgot how to believe in themselves." He gestured toward the blackened remains of the barn. "This isn't just about building a barn. It's about remembering what we're capable of when we stop making excuses and start making things happen." As the sun began to set behind the western hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Zeke Carter stood alone among the ruins of the barn he'd built 3 decades earlier. His hand rested on the smooth silver of his spurs, feeling the weight of history and the promise of tomorrow. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and the sound carried across the prairie like a challenge to anyone brave enough to answer. Dawn broke over Millbrook with the kind of crystalline clarity that promised a perfect autumn day, the sort of weather that made a man grateful to be alive and ambitious enough to believe he could move mountains. Zeke Carter was already at the barn site when the first light touched the eastern horizon, standing among the charred ruins with a cup of coffee steaming in his hands and a look of quiet concentration on his weathered face. He'd been there for over an hour, walking slowly through the debris, occasionally bending to examine a particular beam or foundation stone. To anyone watching from a distance, he might have looked like an old man lost in memories, but his movements were those of a craftsman, assessing materials, cataloguing what could be salvaged and what would need to be replaced. In his free hand, he held a charred beam that had once been part of the original structure, running his fingers along its surface with the reverence of someone handling a family heirloom. The beam was black as midnight, its surface cracked and splintered by the heat of the fire, but underneath the char, the wood was still sound. Zeke had cut this timber himself 30 years ago, selecting each piece with the care of a man who understood that buildings were more than just shelter. They were promises made to future generations, commitments to stand firm against whatever storms might come. The beam represented everything he'd once been capable of, and everything he hoped to prove he could still accomplish. By the time the sun was fully up, a small crowd had gathered to watch the old man work. They came in ones and twos, drawn by curiosity and the human instinct to witness either a miracle or a spectacular failure. Most expected the latter, though they were too polite to say so directly. Instead, they stood at a respectful distance, speaking in hushed tones about the impossibility of the task and the sadness of watching a once great man overreach himself. Jake Morrison arrived just as the church bell was tolling 8 o'clock, riding up on his best horse with the air of a man who expected to be entertained. He dismounted with a flourish and surveyed the scene with the satisfied expression of someone who had invested in a sure thing. "Well, well," he called out, his voice carrying across the morning air. "I see our master builder is hard at work. How's it coming along there, Zeke?" Zeke looked up from his examination of the foundation stones, his expression unchanged. "Coming along fine, Jake. Just getting a feel for what needs to be done." "Uh-huh." Jake walked over to the ruins, his boots crunching on the scattered debris. "And how exactly do you plan to build a barn without lumber, without tools, without help?" "One problem at a time," Zeke replied calmly. "First, I need to clear this debris and assess what can be salvaged. Then I'll worry about the rest." Jake laughed, but it was a sound without humor. "You know what I think? I think you're going to spend the next 7 days puttering around in these ruins, and then you're going to come up with some excuse about why you couldn't finish. Age, weather, lack of materials, something that lets you save face while admitting you bit off more than you could chew." The crowd stirred uneasily at Jake's words, recognizing the challenge in his tone. This was no longer just about building a barn, it was becoming a test of wills between two very different visions of what the town could be. Jake represented progress, efficiency, the belief that some problems were too big for old-fashioned solutions. Zeke represented something harder to define, a faith in human capability that transcended age and circumstances. "Tell you what," Jake continued, warming to his theme, "I'll make this interesting. If you can actually build a barn in 7 days, I'll not only eat my hat, I'll donate $100 to the church fund. But if you can't, you pack up and leave town. For good this time." The murmur that ran through the crowd was the sound of people realizing they were witnessing something significant, a moment that would be talked about for years to come. Sarah Mitchell pushed through the group, her face flushed with indignation. "That's enough, Jake," she said, her voice sharp with anger. "Mr. Carter doesn't need to prove anything to you or anyone else." "Actually," Zeke said quietly, "I think I do." He set down his coffee cup and walked over to where Jake stood, his movements deliberate and measured. "You're right about one thing, Jake. This town needs to decide what it believes in. Are we the kind of people who give up when things get difficult, or are we the kind who find a way to get things done?" He gestured toward the ruins around them. "This barn stood for 30 years. It sheltered your cattle, your neighbors' cattle, provided a place for community gatherings, barn dances, harvest celebrations. It was built by hand, with simple tools, and the kind of determination that seems to be going out of style." Jake's face reddened. "Times change, old man. We can't solve every problem with muscle and stubbornness." "No," Zeke agreed, "but we can solve this one." The confrontation was interrupted by the arrival of Mayor Thompson, who had heard about the gathering from his wife and hurried over to prevent what he feared might become an ugly scene. "Now, gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the forced cheer of a man trying to diffuse a situation he didn't fully understand. "Let's not let this get out of hand. We're all on the same side here." "Are we?" Jake asked, his eyes still locked on Zeke's face, because it seems to me like we're being asked to choose between living in the past and facing the future. Zeke nodded slowly. In a way, that's exactly what you're being asked to do. The question is, do you have the courage to choose correctly? The crowd fell silent, sensing that they had reached a moment of truth. Even the children seemed to understand that something important was happening, though they couldn't quite grasp what it was. Sarah found herself holding her breath, waiting to see which way the town would turn. It was then that Zeke Carter made his declaration, the words that would transform a simple construction project into something approaching legend. "I'll build you a barn," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the morning air. "Starting today, finishing in 7 days. It'll be stronger than the one that burned, big enough to shelter every head of cattle in the county and built to last another 30 years. He paused, looking around at the faces surrounding him. "But I won't be doing it alone. This is going to take the whole community working together, the way things used to be done. Anyone who wants to help is welcome. Anyone who doesn't can stand aside and watch." Jake Morrison's laugh was harsh and bitter. "You think these people are going to risk their reputations on your delusions? They've got families to think about, businesses to run. They can't afford to waste time on a fool's errand." "We'll see," Zeke said simply. He turned to address the crowd directly. "I'm not asking anyone to take this on faith. I'm asking you to give me a chance to show you what's possible. If you've got doubts, that's fine. Doubt keeps you honest, but don't let doubt keep you from trying." He bent down and picked up a piece of charred wood, hefting it in his hands. This barn didn't burn because it was poorly built. It burned because lightning struck it and fire consumed it. But the foundation is still sound, the location is still perfect, and the need is still there. All we have to do is build it again. The silence that followed was broken by an unexpected voice. "I'll help." Everyone turned to see Tommy Morrison, Jake's own nephew, a boy of 16 who had been standing at the edge of the crowd. He was a thin, quiet kid who had been working on his uncle's ranch since his parents died in an influenza outbreak 2 years earlier. His offer to help was the last thing anyone expected, especially Jake. "Tommy, you get back to the ranch," Jake said, his voice tight with embarrassment. "You've got chores to do." "Chores can wait," Tommy replied, his voice stronger than anyone had heard it before. "This is more important." Zeke smiled for the first time that morning, a genuine expression that transformed his weathered face. "Thank you, son. I can use all the help I can get." The boy's decision seemed to break some kind of spell. One by one, other voices began to speak up. Pete Henley's son volunteered. Mrs. Patterson said she could provide meals for the workers. Even Sarah Mitchell stepped forward, offering to help organize the effort. Jake Morrison watched in growing frustration as his certainty about the project's failure began to crumble. "You people are making a mistake," he said, his voice rising. "You're going to waste a week on something that can't be done, and then you'll be worse off than when you started." "Maybe," Zeke acknowledged, "but maybe not. Only one way to find out." As the crowd began to disperse, people talking excitedly about the work ahead, Jake Morrison found himself standing alone among the ruins, holding the charred beam that Zeke had set aside. He hefted it in his hands, feeling its weight, and for the first time began to wonder if he might have underestimated the old man. The beam was damaged but not destroyed, scarred but still fundamentally sound. It occurred to Jake that the same might be true of the man who had built it, and for the first time since Zeke's return, he felt a flicker of uncertainty about the outcome of the bet he'd made. The sun climbed higher, warming the autumn air and casting long shadows across the prairie. In the distance, a hawk circled lazily on the thermal currents, its cry echoing across the grassland like a call to action. 7 days stretched ahead like a road leading either to triumph or disaster, and the only way to know which it would be was to start walking. The first day of what would become known as the Great Barn Project began with the kind of methodical precision that would have impressed anyone who took the time to observe it closely. Unfortunately, most of the town's residents were too skeptical to give Zeke Carter the benefit of careful observation. Instead, They watched from their windows and doorways as the old man worked among the ruins, shaking their heads at what they assumed was the stubborn delusion of a man who had outlived his usefulness. Zeke had risen before dawn, as had been his habit for over 90 years, and made his way to the barn site with a canvas bag slung over his shoulder. From the bag, he withdrew a collection of tools that looked as ancient as their owner, but had been maintained with the kind of care that spoke of a lifetime of respect for good craftsmanship. There was a hammer whose handle had been worn smooth by countless hours of use, a level that had been his father's, and a measuring tape so old that the numbers had been repainted by hand more than once. These were the tools he'd inherited from his grandfather, a man who had built some of the first permanent structures in Kansas when the territory was still young and wild. The tools had been passed down through 3 generations of men who understood that the quality of your work was only as good as the quality of your equipment, and that both were only as good as the man who wielded them. As the sun climbed higher, casting longer shadows across the prairie, Zeke began the painstaking process of clearing the debris from the foundation. To the casual observer, it might have looked like the random puttering of an old man with nothing better to do, but every movement was purposeful, every decision calculated. He sorted the charred wood into pilesome pieces too damaged to be of use, others that could be salvaged and incorporated into the new structure. The foundation stones were examined one by one, tested for stability, and either set aside for reuse or marked for replacement. Tommy Morrison arrived just as the church bell was tolling 9 o'clock, carrying a bucket of water and a sandwich wrapped in cloth. He'd told his uncle he was going to check on the cattle in the south pasture, which was technically true, though he planned to make a significant detour on the way. At 16, Tommy was old enough to understand that he was witnessing something important, even if he couldn't quite articulate what it was. "Morning, Mr. Carter," Tommy said, setting down the bucket and unwrapping the sandwich. "Thought you might be getting hungry." Zeke looked up from his work, his face streaked with soot and sweat. "That's mighty thoughtful of you, son. And call me Zeke. Anyone who's willing to work alongside me has earned the right to use my given name." The boy beamed at this acknowledgement, feeling for the first time in years that he was being treated as something more than just another pair of hands. "What can I do to help?" Zeke studied Tommy's face, seeing in it the kind of eager determination that reminded him of his own youth. "Can you handle a hammer?" "Yes, sir. Yes, Zeke." "Good. We're going to start by pulling the nails out of these salvageable boards. Each nail we can save is one less we'll have to find somewhere else." For the next hour, the two worked in companionable silence, Tommy learning through observation the patient, methodical approach that had made Zeke legendary. The boy was surprised to discover that there was a rhythm to the work, a way of moving that conserved energy while maximizing efficiency. Zeke showed him how to position the hammer for maximum leverage, how to read the grain of the wood to predict where it might split, how to work with the materials rather than against them. "My uncle says you're wasting your time," Tommy said eventually, his voice carefully neutral. "Says there's no way to build a barn in 7 days. Zeke paused in his work, wiping his forehead with the back of his sleeve. "Your uncle's entitled to his opinion. What do you think?" Tommy considered this carefully. "I think—" He stopped, seeming to weigh his words. "I think maybe it's not about whether it can be done. Maybe it's about whether it's worth trying." Zeke smiled, recognizing in the boy's words a wisdom that often came to the young before age, and experience taught them to be cautious. "That's a good way to look at it, son. Sometimes the trying is more important than the succeeding." By midday, word had spread throughout the town that actual work was taking place at the barn site. A small crowd began to gather, drawn by the same curiosity that makes people slow down to look at accident scenes. Most expected to see confirmation of their skepticism, but what they found instead was something that made them slightly uncomfortable, evidence of genuine progress. The debris had been cleared and sorted with military precision. The foundation stones had been examined and catalogued. Most surprisingly, a significant pile of salvageable lumber had been accumulated, each piece cleaned and stacked according to size and quality. It wasn't the random activity of a deluded old manite, it was the systematic preparation of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Sarah Mitchell arrived with a basket of food and a thermos of coffee, her presence drawing approving nods from the other women in the crowd. She'd spent the morning thinking about Zeke's declaration, trying to decide whether she believed it was possible or simply admired the courage it took to try. Either way, she'd concluded that a man undertaking such a task deserved support, regardless of the outcome. "Mr. Carter," she called out, "I brought you some lunch." Zeke straightened slowly, his joints protesting the morning's work. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Mitchell. Tommy and I were just discussing the virtues of regular meals." She spread a cloth on a clean section of foundation stone and laid out cold chicken, fresh bread, and apple slices. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but do you really think this is possible? Building a barn in 7 days?" Zeke accepted a cup of coffee gratefully, savoring the warmth as it spread through his chest. "I think a lot of things are possible if you're willing to work for them. The question isn't whether it's possible, the question is whether we're willing to find out." "But the time constraint," Sarah pressed. 7 days seems impossible, Zeke finished. "Maybe. But I've seen impossible things happen before. I've seen towns rise from nothing, bridges span uncrossable rivers. People accomplish things that everyone said couldn't be done. The secret isn't having special powers or superhuman strength. The secret is breaking big problems into smaller ones and solving them one at a time." Tommy nodded enthusiastically, "Like clearing the debris first, then sorting the lumber, then—" "Exactly." Zeke's eyes crinkled with approval. "A barn isn't built all at once. It's built one board at a time, one nail at a time, one decision at a time. String enough of those together, and pretty soon you've got something that'll stand for generations." The afternoon brought more volunteers, though most came with the air of people who were curious rather than committed. Pete Henley's son arrived with a wagon, offering to help haul away the debris that couldn't be salvaged. Mrs. Patterson brought her eldest grandson, thinking that the boy could benefit from seeing honest work being done. Even Doc Reynolds stopped by, ostensibly to check on Zeke's health, but really to see for himself what all the fuss was about. With each new arrival, the nature of the project began to shift. What had started as one old man's quixotic quest was becoming something more collaborative, more communal. People who had come to watch found themselves picking up tools, offering suggestions, contributing their own expertise to the effort. The barn was no longer just Zeke's responsibility, it was becoming the town's. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Zeke called a halt to the day's work. The site had been transformed from a chaotic ruin into an organized workspace, with materials sorted, tools arranged, and the foundation cleared and assessed. It was modest progress by any measure, but it was unmistakably progress. "Same time tomorrow?" Tommy asked, reluctant to leave. "Same time tomorrow," Zeke confirmed. "We'll start laying out the frame." As the volunteers dispersed, heading home to their families and their evening chores, Sarah lingered behind. She'd watched Zeke work throughout the afternoon, noting the way he moved with economical precision, the way he seemed to anticipate problems before they arose, the way he treated each piece of wood with the respect due to something that had once been alive. "You really know what you're doing, don't you?" she said. Zeke hefted his grandfather's hammer, feeling its familiar weight. "I've been building things for a long time," he said simply, "long enough to know that the hardest part isn't the building, it's convincing people that it's worth doing." In the distance, a coyote howled, its voice carrying across the prairie like a reminder that the wilderness was never far away, that the things humans built were always temporary shelters against the vast indifference of the natural world. But for now, in this moment, with the promise of tomorrow's work ahead of them, that seemed like enough. The third day dawned grey and cold, with the kind of overcast sky that promised rain before evening. Zeke Carter stood at his bedroom window, looking out at the threatening clouds and calculating how much work could be accomplished if the weather turned against them. In his breast pocket, Wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the elements, he carried a faded photograph that had been his constant companion for the past 20 years. The photograph showed a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, her hair pinned up in the fashion of the 1870s. Beside her stood a man who looked like a younger version of Zeke, his arm around her waist, both of them beaming with the joy of people who believed the future held nothing but promise. Martha had been her name, and she had been the light of his life until that terrible winter when influenza had taken her and their unborn child within the space of a week. He'd carried the photograph with him through 20 years of wandering, taking it out in moments of doubt or loneliness, drawing strength from the memory of what it had felt like to be needed, to be part of something larger than himself. Now, with the barn project entering its third day, he found himself looking at it again, wondering if Martha would approve of what he was trying to accomplish. The barn site was already busy when he arrived, with Tommy Morrison and 2 other young men working to lay out the lumber according to the plan Zeke had sketched in the dirt the previous evening. The sight of additional volunteers lifted his spirits, though he was careful not to show too much enthusiasm. He'd learned long ago that people were more likely to commit to something if they felt they were making their own choice rather than being recruited. "Morning, Zeke," Tommy called out, his voice carrying a confidence that hadn't been there 2 days earlier. "We started sorting the lumber by length, like you showed us." "Good thinking," Zeke replied, examining the neat piles of wood. "And who are your friends?" "This is Billy Patterson," Tommy said, indicating a stocky young man with calloused hands. "He works at the lumber mill, and this is Samuel Creek. He's been helping his dad with carpentry since he was 12. Zeke shook hands with both young men, noting the firmness of their grips and the calluses that spoke of honest work. "Glad to have you aboard," he said. "We're going to need all the help we can get." As the morning progressed, the small crew fell into a rhythm that surprised even Zeke with its efficiency. Billy's experience at the lumber mill proved invaluable when it came to judging the quality of the salvaged wood, while Samuel's carpentry background allowed him to anticipate Zeke's needs often before they were voiced. Tommy, meanwhile, had appointed himself as the unofficial coordinator, keeping track of tools and materials with an organizational ability that would have impressed a military quartermaster. The first real test came when they began laying out the frame for the barn's foundation. It was precision work that required careful measurement and absolute accuracy. Mistake at this stage would compromise the entire structure. Zeke worked slowly and deliberately, using his grandfather's level to ensure that every beam was perfectly aligned, while the younger men watched and learned. "Why is it so important that everything be exactly level?" Samuel asked, holding one end of a measuring tape. "Because a building is only as strong as its foundation," Zeke explained, adjusting a beam by fractions of an inch. "If we're off by even a little bit here, that error will multiply as we go higher. By the time we get to the roof, we could be off by feet instead of inches." Billy nodded thoughtfully. "Like at the mill. If the saw blade is even slightly dull, the first few cuts might look fine, but by the end of the day, you're producing nothing but scrap." "Exactly." Zeke straightened up, his joints protesting the constant bending and kneeling. "Craftsmanship isn't about working fast, it's about working right." The arrival of Pete Henley interrupted their concentration. Pete was a grizzled veteran of the Civil War who had lost his left arm at Gettysburg, but had learned to do the work of 2 men with his remaining hand. He approached the work site with the rolling gait of someone who had spent too many years in the saddle, his weathered face set in an expression of skeptical curiosity. "Heard you boys were making progress out here," Pete said, his eyes taking in the organized layout of materials and the precisely aligned foundation beams. "Have to admit, it looks more professional than I expected." Zeke looked up from his work, recognizing in Pete's tone the grudging respect of one craftsman for another. "Pete Henley," he said, extending his hand, "heard you've been keeping busy since the war." "Busy enough," Pete replied, accepting the handshake with his good hand. "Been thinking about what you said the other day, about the town needing to decide what it believes in." He paused, studying the work in progress. "Mind if an old soldier lends a hand?" The addition of Pete to the crew brought not just another pair of hands, but a wealth of experience in organizing large projects under difficult conditions. During the war, he'd been responsible for building bridges, fortifications, and temporary structures that had to be completed quickly and built to last. His military background showed in the way he approached problems systematically, breaking complex tasks into manageable steps. The thing about building under pressure, Pete explained to the younger men as they worked to square the corners of the foundation, is that you can't afford to waste motion. Every movement has to have a purpose. Every decision has to move you closer to your goal. By midday, they had attracted a small crowd of observers, including several who had come prepared to work. Mrs. Patterson arrived with her grandson and a wagon full of tools borrowed from various households around town. Sarah Mitchell came with lunch for the crew and stayed to help organize the materials. Even Doc Reynolds rolled up his sleeves and pitched in, claiming that physical labor was good for his circulation. The transformation of the project from a one-man crusade to a community effort was subtle but unmistakable. People who had come to watch found themselves drawn into the work, offering suggestions based on their own experience, contributing tools and materials from their own supplies. The barn was no longer just Zeke's vision, it was becoming something that belonged to the entire town. Jake Morrison arrived just as the crew was breaking for lunch, his face set in the kind of grim determination that suggested he had come to confirm his worst fears about the project's progress. Instead, he found a scene that challenged every assumption he had made about the futility of the effort. The foundation was not only laid out but partially assembled, with the precision joinery that marked the work of a master craftsman. The materials were organized with military efficiency, and the crew worked with the kind of focused intensity that he associated with experienced professionals rather than amateur volunteers. "I'll be damned," Jake muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. Zeke looked up from the beam he was positioning, his face neutral but his eyes watchful. "Something I can help you with, Jake?" "Just checking on your progress," Jake replied, his voice carefully casual. "Have to admit, this looks more organized than I expected." "Organization is the key to any successful project," Zeke said simply. "That and having people who are willing to do the work." Jake walked slowly around the foundation, examining the joinery with the critical eye of someone who knew quality when he saw it. Despite his skepticism about the timeline, he couldn't find fault with the craftsmanship. Every joint was tight, every measurement precise, every beam positioned with the kind of care that suggested the builder intended the structure to last for generations. "It's good work," he admitted reluctantly. "But you're still talking about finishing this in 4 more days. Even with all these people helping, I don't see how." "How what?" Pete Henley interrupted, his voice carrying the edge that had once made Confederate soldiers think twice about challenging him. "How a bunch of supposedly over-the-hill, old-timers and untested youngsters could accomplish something that you've already decided is impossible." Jake's face reddened. "That's not what I meant, isn't it?" Pete stepped closer, his single hand clenched into a fist. "Seems to me like you've been so busy explaining why this can't be done that you haven't bothered to look at what's actually being accomplished." The tension between the two men was broken by Zeke's calm voice. "Gentlemen, we're all on the same side here. Jake has every right to be skeptical. I'd be suspicious of anyone who wasn't. The proof will be in the finished product, not in arguments about what's possible." As the afternoon wore on, the foundation took shape with increasing speed and precision. The crew had learned to work together efficiently, with each person understanding their role and contributing their expertise to the common goal. Tommy had emerged as a natural leader among the younger workers, while Pete provided the organizational skills needed to keep materials and tools flowing smoothly. Sarah found herself drawn into the work, despite her initial intention to simply provide support. She discovered that she had a talent for measuring and marking cuts, and her attention to detail proved invaluable in ensuring that every piece fit exactly where it was supposed to. More importantly, she found herself watching Zeke, with growing admiration for the way he managed to inspire confidence while maintaining the exacting standards that quality construction demanded. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, Zeke called for the end of the day's work. The foundation was complete, square and level, and built to last. It was substantial progress, but everyone understood that the real test would come with the vertical construction that lay ahead. "Tomorrow we start on the frame," Zeke announced, his voice carrying clearly across the worksite. "That's when we'll find out what we're really made of." As the volunteers gathered their tools and prepared to head home, Pete Henley approached Zeke with a question that had been nagging at him all afternoon. "Mind if I ask you something, Zeke? This barn you're building's not just about proving a point, is it?" Zeke was quiet for a long moment, his hand moving instinctively to the photograph in his breast pocket. "No," he said finally. "It's about remembering what it feels like to build something that matters, something that will outlast the people who built it." He looked around at the completed foundation, solid and true in the gathering twilight. "It's about leaving something behind that says we were here and we cared enough to do our best work." In the distance, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and somewhere a nightbird called out with a voice that seemed to echo across the years, connecting the present moment to all the other moments when people had gathered together to create something larger than themselves. The foundation was done, but the real building was just beginning. The fourth day began with the kind of crisp autumn morning that made every breath feel like a small celebration of being alive. Zeke Carter arrived at the worksite to find that someone had already started a fire in a metal barrel, providing warmth for the early arrivals who were sorting through the materials needed for the day's work. Coiled beside his tool bag was a length of braided leather rope, weathered brown with age and soft with use. The rope had been made from the hide of his first horse, a spirited mare named Stella, who had carried him across 3 territories during his younger days as an itinerant builder. When Stella had finally died of old age, Zeke had honored her memory by crafting the rope with his own hands, braiding the leather with the same care he brought to all his work. The rope had become his measuring line, his guide for ensuring that walls were straight and corners were true. More than that, it had become a symbol of the connections that bound past to present, the threads that linked one generation to the next. Tommy Morrison was already at work, having arrived before sunrise, with an enthusiasm that reminded Zeke of his own youth. The boy had spent the previous evening reading everything he could find about barn construction, borrowing books from neighbors, and studying the techniques with the intensity of a scholar preparing for examinations. "Morning, Zeke," Tommy called out, his breath visible in the cold air. "I've been thinking about the frame construction. If we use a bent system like they do in New England, we could raise the entire side wall as a unit instead of building it piece by piece." Zeke smiled at the boy's eagerness, recognizing in it the kind of innovative thinking that had always driven progress. "That's good thinking, son. But bent construction requires more precise cutting and more coordinated lifting. Are we ready for that level of complexity?" "I think we are," Tommy replied, his voice carrying a confidence that hadn't been there a few days earlier. "Pete's been teaching us military coordination. Billy knows wood better than anyone in town, and Samuel's got the carpentry skills to handle the precision work." As if summoned by their conversation, the other members of the crew began to arrive, each bringing their own tools and their own enthusiasm for the day's work. Pete Henley came with a detailed plan for organizing the frame raising, drawn from his experience in military engineering. Billy Patterson brought a selection of the best lumber from the mill, carefully chosen for strength and straightness. Samuel Creek arrived with his father's complete set of chisels, ready to tackle the precision joinery that bent construction demanded. The sight of the growing crew filled Zeke with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire barrel. When he had made his promise to build the barn in 7 days, he had been thinking primarily of his own abilities, his own determination to prove that age hadn't diminished his skills. Now he realized that the project had become something much larger than his personal quest. It had become a testament to what a community could accomplish when it worked together toward a common goal. Sarah Mitchell arrived with a wagon load of coffee and fresh-baked bread, but she didn't stop there. She had spent the previous evening learning about barn construction from her late husband's books, and she came prepared to contribute more than just moral support. "I've been thinking about the roof structure," she said, spreading her husband's drawings on a makeshift table made from sawhorses and planks. "If we use a gambrel design instead of a simple gable, we can increase the storage capacity in the loft without adding significantly to the construction time." Zeke studied the drawings with growing appreciation for Sarah's analytical mind. "That's excellent thinking. The gambrel roof is more complex, but if we can manage it, you're right about the storage benefits." "I can handle the angle cuts," Samuel offered, examining the drawings over Zeke's shoulder. "My father taught me how to calculate rafter angles when I was 14. "And I can coordinate the raising," Pete added. "It's just like setting up artillery. Everything has to be positioned exactly right, and everyone has to know their role." As the morning progressed, the barn frame began to take shape with a speed and precision that surprised even Zeke. The crew had developed an almost telepathic understanding of each other's movements, with each person anticipating what would be needed next and positioning themselves accordingly. Tommy had indeed become a natural leader, coordinating the work with the kind of easy authority that suggested he might have found his calling. The first wall went up without a hitch, the pre-assembled bent rising smoothly into position and locking into place with the satisfying precision of a well-made puzzle. The second wall followed shortly after, and by midday they had 3 walls standing and were preparing to tackle the most challenging part of the construction, the front wall with its large doors and complex framing. It was then that Jake Morrison arrived with a group of men from his ranch, their faces set in expressions that suggested trouble. Jake had spent the previous evening drinking and brooding about the progress of the barn project, and he had reached the conclusion that Zeke's growing success was somehow a personal affront to his authority as the town's leading rancher. "Well, well," Jake said, his voice carrying across the worksite with the kind of false heartiness that usually preceded conflict. "Look at all this progress. Must be nice to have so many people willing to waste their time on a hopeless cause." Zeke looked up from the beam he was positioning, his face calm, but his eyes alert. "Nothing hopeless about it, Jake. We're making good progress." "Are you?" Jake walked around the partially completed structure, examining it with exaggerated care. "Because it looks to me like you're building a barn that's going to fall down the first time the wind blows." The insult was deliberate and unmistakable, a challenge to Zeke's professional competence that couldn't be ignored. The worksite fell silent as everyone waited to see how the old man would respond. "These joints are as solid as anything I've ever built," Zeke said quietly. "If you've got specific concerns about the construction, I'm happy to address them." "My concern," Jake replied, his voice rising, "is that you're encouraging these people to believe in something that's impossible. When this barn collapses, and it will collapse, you'll be long gone, but they'll be the ones left to deal with the consequences." Pete Henley stepped forward, his single hand clenched into a fist. "That's enough, Morrison. You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Jake turned to face Pete directly. "I know that Zeke Carter disappeared 20 years ago when things got difficult, and I know he'll disappear again when this project fails. He's not building a barn, he's building false hope, and some of us aren't willing to stand by and watch it happen." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a poorly banked fire, acrid and difficult to ignore. Everyone present understood that Jake had crossed a line, moving from skepticism about the project to personal attacks on Zeke's character and history. Sarah Mitchell was the first to respond, her voice cutting through the tension with the clarity of a church bell. "Mr. Morrison, I think you've said enough. Mr. Carter has done nothing but work harder than men half his age to help this community. If you can't find it in yourself to support that effort, at least have the decency not to interfere with it." "Interfere?" Jake's laugh was bitter and harsh. "Lady, I'm trying to save these people from their own gullibility. When this barn falls down and someone gets hurt, you'll wish you'd listened to me." That was when Zeke Carter did something that no one expected. Instead of responding with anger or defending his competence, he walked over to the braided leather rope that lay coiled beside his tools. He picked it up and handed one end to Jake Morrison. "Tell you what," Zeke said, his voice calm and measured. "Let's test the strength of what we've built so far. This rope is 30 feet long and has held the weight of everything from cattle to fully loaded wagons. If you can pull down any part of this frame using this rope, I'll pack up my tools and leave town tonight." Jake stared at the rope as if it were a snake, understanding instinctively that he was being offered something more than a simple test of construction quality. This was a moment of truth, a chance to prove his claims or be revealed as someone who was more interested in tearing down than building up. "Go ahead," Zeke continued, his eyes never leaving Jake's face. "Pick any joint, any connection, any part of the structure that you think is weak. Give it everything you've got." The silence that followed was the kind that occurs when everyone present understands that they are witnessing something significant, a moment that will be remembered and talked about for years to come. Jake Morrison looked around at the faces surrounding him, seeing in them a mixture of curiosity and challenge, knowing that his response would define not just this moment, but his relationship with the community going forward. In the distance, a hawk circled on the thermal currents rising from the prairie, its cry echoing across the grassland like a call to judgment. The rope lay between the two men like a line drawn in the dust, and everyone waited to see which side of that line Jake Morrison would choose to stand on. The fifth day began with an unexpected sound, the steady rhythm of rain drumming against Zeke Carter's window. He lay in his narrow bed at the boarding house, listening to the weather that threatened to wash away days of progress, and felt the familiar weight of the silver pocket watch in the drawer beside his bed. The watch had belonged to his father, and his father before him, but for Zeke it had become something more personal than a family heirloom. It had stopped at exactly 3:47 on a February morning 20 years ago, the precise moment when Martha had drawn her last breath and he had never had the heart to wind it again. The stopped watch had become his constant reminder of time suspended, of a life that had ground to a halt in the space between one heartbeat and the next. For 2 decades he had carried it as a penance, a way of ensuring that he never forgot the cost of caring too deeply about anything or anyone. But now, with the barn project entering its 5th day and the community rallying around a shared purpose, he found himself wondering if it might be time to let time move forward again. The rain was still falling when he arrived at the worksite, but it was the gentle, steady precipitation that farmers prayed for rather than the violent downpour that could destroy a day's work. The crew had already gathered under a makeshift shelter constructed from salvaged lumber and canvas, their faces showing the kind of determined cheerfulness that characterized people who refused to let weather dictate their plans. "Morning, Zeke," Tommy called out, his voice carrying over the sound of rain on canvas. "We've been talking about how to keep working in this weather. Pete thinks we can frame the roof sections under the shelter and raise them when the rain stops." Zeke nodded approvingly, impressed once again by the crew's ability to adapt and improvise. "That's good thinking. We can also use this time to work on the detailed carpentry door frames, window casings, things that require precision rather than heavy lifting." Sarah Mitchell emerged from the shelter with a steaming cup of coffee, her hair damp from the rain but her eyes bright, with the kind of energy that came from being part of something important. "I've been thinking about what Mr. Morrison said yesterday," she began, her voice carefully measured, "about the barn falling down in the wind. And?" Zeke accepted the coffee gratefully, savoring its warmth as it spread through his chest. "I think he's scared," Sarah said simply. "Not of the barn falling down, but of being wrong about what's possible. He's invested so much in the idea that this can't be done, that success would force him to reconsider everything he believes about progress and tradition." Zeke studied her face, seeing in it the kind of insight that came from understanding people rather than just judging them. "That's a generous way to look at it." "Maybe, but I think generous interpretations are usually closer to the truth than harsh ones. People don't usually act out of pure malice, they act out of fear, or hurt, or the need to protect something they value. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Pete Henley, who approached with the purposeful stride of someone bringing important news. "Zeke, we've got a problem. Jake Morrison was here early this morning, before any of us arrived. Looks like he tried to loosen some of the connections we made yesterday." The words hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire, acrid and dangerous. Zeke set down his coffee cup and followed Pete to examine the areas in question, his movements careful and deliberate. What he found confirmed Pete's suspicions. Several of the mortise and tenon joints showed signs of having been tampered with, the wooden pins that held them in place partially withdrawn. "How bad is it?" Tommy asked, his face pale with concern. Zeke examined each joint systematically, testing the connections and assessing the damage. "Not as bad as it could have been," he said finally. "The joints are still structurally sound, but they'll need to be reset and reinforced. It'll cost us maybe half a day's work." "That son of a—" Pete began, his voice tight with anger. "Easy," Zeke interrupted, his tone calm but firm. "Getting angry won't fix the problem. Besides, this tells us something important about Jake Morrison's state of mind. A man who's confident in his position doesn't resort to sabotage." Sarah shook her head in disbelief. "I can't believe he would stoop to something like this. What if someone had been hurt?" "That's exactly why we need to be careful," Zeke replied. "We're not just building a barn anymore, we're proving a point about what this community believes in. Every joint has to be perfect. Every connection has to be absolutely solid. We can't give anyone a reason to say we cut corners or compromised on quality." The rain continued throughout the morning, providing a steady soundtrack to their work as they methodically repaired the sabotage joints and reinforced the connections with additional pins and braces. The crew worked with a quiet intensity that spoke of shared anger channeled into productive purpose, each person understanding that they were no longer just racing against time, but also against someone who was actively working against their success. Billy Patterson proved particularly valuable during this phase, his experience at the lumber mill allowing him to identify stress points and potential failure modes that might not have been obvious to less experienced eyes. "This joint here," he said, pointing to a connection between two major beams. "It's solid now, but if it ever started to work loose, the whole wall could shift. We should add a diagonal brace just to be safe." Samuel Creek nodded in agreement, already calculating the angle and length of lumber they would need. "I can cut that this afternoon. Better to over-engineer it than to give Morrison any ammunition for his arguments." As the day progressed, the barn began to take on the appearance of a structure that was built to last not just years, but decades. Every joint was reinforced beyond the normal standards, every connection was tested and retested. Every piece of lumber was selected and positioned with the kind of care usually reserved for fine furniture rather than agricultural buildings. The rain finally stopped in the early afternoon, revealing a sky that had been washed clean and air that sparkled with the kind of clarity that made everything seem possible. The crew emerged from their shelter, like miners coming up from underground, blinking in the sudden brightness and stretching muscles that had been cramped by close work under low canvas. "Time to raise the roof sections," Pete announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had coordinated complex operations under difficult conditions. "Everyone knows their position." The roof raising was the most technically challenging part of the entire project, requiring precise coordination between multiple teams working at dangerous heights. Zeke had designed the roof using Sarah's gambrel concept, which would provide maximum storage space in the loft while maintaining the structural integrity needed to withstand prairie winds. The first section went up without incident, sliding into position with the smooth precision of a well-rehearsed dance. The second section proved more challenging, requiring adjustments and repositioning before it settled into place with a satisfying thunk that spoke of joints fitting exactly as they were designed to do. It was during the positioning of the third section that disaster nearly struck. The lifting rope, stretched to its maximum capacity by the weight of the heavy timber frame, began to fray where it passed over the pulley. Samuel Creek spotted the problem just as the first strands began to part. his shout of warning giving the crew time to lower the section safely before the rope could fail completely. "Close one," Pete muttered, examining the frayed rope with the clinical attention of someone who had seen too many near misses in his military career. "Another few seconds and we would have had a serious accident." Zeke studied the damaged rope, his mind already calculating the implications of the delay. "How long to get a replacement?" "Hour, maybe 2, Billy replied. "I can ride to the mill and borrow their block and tackle." "Do it," Zeke decided. "We can't afford to take chances with safety, not now." As Billy rode off toward the lumber mill, the rest of the crew settled in to wait, using the time to double-check their work and make minor adjustments to the positioning of the completed sections. It was during this lull that Jake Morrison made his appearance, riding up with the kind of studied casualness that suggested he had been watching from a distance and had timed his arrival to coincide with the crew's difficulties. "Having problems?" Jake asked, his voice carrying just enough concern to make the question sound legitimate, while his eyes betrayed his satisfaction at their predicament. "Nothing we can't handle," Zeke replied evenly. "Just being cautious about safety." "Safety," Jake repeated, as if the word had a bitter taste. "Funny how safety becomes a concern when you're behind schedule." Sarah stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. "Mr. Morrison, I think you've caused enough trouble for one day. Perhaps you should leave." Jake's face showed genuine surprise. "Trouble? What trouble?" "The joints that were loosened this morning," Pete said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that had once made Confederate soldiers think twice about challenging him. "The connections that were tampered with sometime before dawn." For a moment, Jake's face showed something that might have been genuine confusion, but it was quickly replaced by his usual expression of sardonic amusement. "Are you accusing me of sabotage?" "I'm not accusing you of anything," Zeke said quietly. "I'm just noting that someone tried to weaken the structure, and you're the only person who's expressed opposition to the project." Jake studied the faces surrounding him, seeing in them a mixture of suspicion and hostility that hadn't been there even a day earlier. The sabotage, whether he had been responsible for it or not, had transformed him from a skeptic into an enemy, someone who was actively working against the community's interests. "I may not believe in this project," he said finally, "but I would never do anything that could endanger people's lives. If someone loosened those joints, it wasn't me." The ring of sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, and for the first time since the discovery of the sabotage, Zeke found himself wondering if they had been wrong to assume Jake was responsible. The thought was troubling, because if Jake hadn't tampered with the joints, then someone else had someone who was skilled enough to know exactly which connections were critical and subtle enough to avoid detection. In the distance, the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced Billy's return with the replacement rope and tackle. The roof raising could resume, but the question of who had tried to sabotage their work remained unanswered, hanging over the project like a storm cloud that threatened to break at any moment. The 6th day dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline air that made every sound carry farther than it should, and every detail stand out with startling clarity. Sarah Mitchell had arrived at the barn site early, hoping to have a few minutes alone to process everything that had happened over the past week. She found herself drawn to the area where Zeke kept his personal tools, studying the craftsmanship of implements that had clearly been maintained with loving care for decades. It was while examining his tool bag that she noticed the corner of yellowed paper protruding from a side pocket. Her natural curiosity, combined with a growing concern for the man who had become the heart of their community effort, prompted her to pull the paper free. What she found was a letter, creased and worn from years of folding and unfolding, written in the formal script of official correspondence. The letterhead read, "Kansas Pacific Railroad Company," and was dated March 15, 1877. As Sarah read the contents, her hands began to tremble, not from the cold morning air but from the magnitude of what she was discovering. The letter was addressed to Ezekiel Carter, Chief Engineer, Bridge Construction Division, and contained a formal commendation for his work on the most challenging span construction project in the company's history. The letter went on to detail Zeke's accomplishments in terms that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. He hadn't just been a local barn builder, he had been the legendary bridge builder Zeke, responsible for spanning rivers and canyons across 3 states. The letter mentioned structures that Sarah recognized from stories she'd heard growing up. The impossible bridge over Devil's Canyon in Colorado, the railroad span across the Snake River that had been thought unbuildable, the series of trestle bridges through the Montana Territory that had opened the northern route to settlement. But the letter also contained a darker revelation. Attached to the commendation was a secondary document, a report of an investigation into the collapse of a bridge near Denver. The technical language was dry and official, but the human tragedy it described was unmistakable. 17 workers had died when a span under construction had failed during a windstorm. The investigation had cleared Zeke of any wrongdoing, attributing the collapse to unprecedented weather conditions and material failure beyond reasonable prediction. But Sarah could read between the lines and understand why a man might choose to disappear after such a catastrophe. You shouldn't be reading that. Sarah spun around to find Zeke standing behind her, his face pale but his eyes calm. She had been so absorbed in the letter that she hadn't heard him approach, and now she felt like a child caught snooping through private belongings. "I'm sorry," she began, but Zeke held up a hand to stop her. "No need to apologize. I've been carrying that letter for 20 years, and I suppose part of me wanted someone to find it eventually." He moved slowly to sit on a stack of lumber, suddenly looking every one of his 106 years. "Might as well tell you the whole story." Sarah sat beside him, the letter still in her hands, and waited for him to begin. "I was 35 when I built my first bridge," Zeke said, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "Thought I was invincible. Thought I could solve any problem with enough determination and clever engineering. The railroad company called me their miracle worker, sent me to tackle the projects that other engineers said were impossible." He gestured toward the letter. "For 15 years, I lived up to that reputation. Built spans that people said couldn't be built, opened routes that connected communities and changed lives. I was proud of what I accomplished, proud of the legacy I was creating." "What happened in Denver?" Sarah asked, gently. Zeke was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on something far beyond the horizon. "I pushed too hard, tried to complete a project in weather conditions that should have shut down construction. The wind was stronger than predicted, the materials were stressed beyond their limits, and I made the decision to continue work when I should have called a halt." The pain in his voice was evident, the guilt of a man who had carried responsibility for tragedy for 2 decades. 17 good men died because I was too proud to admit that there were forces beyond my control. The investigation cleared me legally, but it couldn't clear me morally." Sarah studied his face, seeing in it the same careful precision that he brought to his construction work. "That's why you left the railroad. That's why you disappeared." "I couldn't trust myself anymore. Every decision became a crisis of confidence. Every project became a reminder of what could go wrong. I convinced myself that the world would be safer if I just went away, found some quiet place to live out my days without the risk of causing more harm." "But you didn't stop building entirely," Sarah observed, thinking of the barn that had stood for 30 years before the fire. "Small projects," Zeke admitted. "Barns, houses, things where the stakes were lower and the consequences of failure were measured in property rather than lives. I told myself it was enough, that I could find satisfaction in modest accomplishments." Sarah looked around at the barn that was taking shape around them, understanding for the first time the true magnitude of what Zeke was attempting. "This isn't just about proving you can still build. This is about proving you can still lead, still take responsibility for other people's safety." Zeke nodded slowly. "I've been running from that responsibility for 20 years, but watching this community come together, seeing people like Tommy and Pete and even you step up to tackle something." The 7th and final day began with the kind of ominous stillness that experienced prairie dwellers recognized as the calm before a significant storm. The air hung heavy and motionless, with an almost electric quality that made horses nervous and sent birds seeking shelter in whatever cover they could find. From his tool bag, Zeke Carter withdrew a faded American flag, carefully folded in the military triangle that honored fallen soldiers, the fabric worn soft by years of handling, but still bearing the proud colors of a nation that had asked much of its people and received it. The flag had been his during the Civil War, carried through battles whose names had become history. Antietam, Gettysburg, Chancellorsville. He had been young then, barely 20, serving as an engineer in the Army Corps that built bridges under fire and fortifications under siege. The flag had been with him when he'd learned to lead men in desperate circumstances, when he'd discovered that the difference between success and catastrophe often came down to keeping your head when everyone else was losing theirs. Now, 45 years later, he hung the flag from a pole at the barn site, watching it stir restlessly in the fitful breeze that preceded the approaching storm. The gesture was both practical and symbolic practical, because it would help gauge wind direction and intensity. Symbolic, because it represented the duty and sacrifice that had shaped his understanding of what it meant to serve something larger than yourself. Tommy Morrison arrived at the work site before full dawn, his young face tight with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. In the space of a week, he had been transformed from a ranch hand who took orders to a leader who inspired confidence in others. The change was visible in the way he carried himself, the way he assessed problems and proposed solutions, the way he had earned the respect of men twice his age. "Morning, Zeke," Tommy said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "Weather looks like it's going to be interesting today." Zeke nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon where dark clouds were building like a wall of slate-grey stone. "Storm's coming, all right. Question is whether it gets here before we finish or after." "Does it matter?" Tommy asked. "I mean, we're so close to completion that even if we don't get the last details finished today, we've proven the point, haven't we?" Zeke studied the boy's face, seeing in it the kind of earnest determination that reminded him of his younger self. "Depends on what point you think we're trying to prove, son. If it's just about building a barn, then you're right, we've already succeeded. But if it's about keeping promises and finishing what we start, then every detail matters." The rest of the crew began arriving as the sun climbed higher, each person bringing their own assessment of the weather and their own determination to see the project through to completion. Pete Henley came with a soldier's understanding that some missions had to be completed regardless of conditions. Billy Patterson brought news from the lumber mill that the storm was expected to hit by mid-afternoon, with winds strong enough to make construction work dangerous. Samuel Creek arrived with his father's complete set of finishing tools, ready to tackle the final carpentry work that would transform a functional structure into something beautiful. Sarah Mitchell was the last to arrive, and when she did, she brought with her a sense of urgency that reflected her understanding of what was at stake. She had spent the previous evening thinking about the revelation of Zeke's true identity, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what he was attempting to accomplish. This wasn't just about proving that an old man could still do physical work, it was about proving that someone who had lost faith in himself could find a way back to purpose and meaning. "How much work is left?" she asked, surveying the barn that stood nearly complete in the morning light. "Not much," Zeke replied, "but what's left requires precision. Final adjustments to the doors, installation of the hardware, some detail work on the interior framing. Under normal circumstances, it would be half a day's work for this crew. But these aren't normal circumstances," Pete observed, nodding toward the approaching storm clouds. "No," Zeke agreed, "they're not." The morning's work proceeded with the kind of focused intensity that characterized people operating under deadline pressure. Every movement was efficient, every decision was quick and final, every task was approached with the understanding that there might not be time for do-overs or second chances. The crew had developed an almost telepathic coordination, with each person anticipating what would be needed next and positioning themselves accordingly. It was during the installation of the heavy barn doors that they encountered their first serious obstacle. The doors, massive constructions of oak planks and iron hardware, required precise alignment to hang properly and function smoothly. But the morning's humidity had caused the wood to swell slightly, making the fit tighter than anticipated. "We need to plane about 1/8 of an inch off the bottom edge," Samuel determined after careful measurement. "Otherwise, they're going to bind when we try to open them." "How long will that take?" Tommy asked, glancing nervously at the darkening sky. "Hour, maybe 2, Samuel replied. "Can't rush precision work like this." It was then that Jake Morrison made his appearance, riding up with a group of men from his ranch and an expression that suggested he had come to witness either triumph or disaster. But something was different about Jake today. The sneering confidence had been replaced by something that looked almost like uncertainty. "Looks like you're cutting it close," Jake observed, dismounting and examining the nearly completed barn with grudging admiration. "Close enough," Zeke replied, not looking up from the door hardware he was adjusting. Jake walked slowly around the structure, his experienced eye taking in the quality of the construction, the sophistication of the engineering, the level of craftsmanship that had gone into every detail. It was clearly the work of someone who knew what he was doing, someone whose skills went far beyond what anyone had expected. "I heard about what Sarah found yesterday," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying a tone that hadn't been there in previous conversations. "About who you really are." Zeke paused in his work, meeting Jake's eyes directly. "And what do you think about that?" "I think—" Jake stopped, seeming to search for words. "I think I owe you an apology and an explanation." The worksite fell silent as everyone waited to hear what Jake Morrison had to say. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if nature itself was holding its breath. "I wasn't the one who loosened those joints," Jake said, his voice carrying the ring of truth. "I'll admit I was hoping this project would fail, but I would never do anything that could hurt someone. I may be stubborn and prideful, but I'm not dangerous." "Then who?" Pete asked, his voice tight with suspicion. Jake's face flushed with embarrassment. "My foreman, Curtis Webb. I'd been complaining about the project, saying it was a waste of time and effort. He thought he was doing me a favor by trying to sabotage it. I fired him yesterday when I figured out what he'd done." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, acrid but dissipating. Zeke studied Jake's face, seeing in it the kind of genuine remorse that was difficult to fake. "Why are you telling us this now?" Sarah asked. Jake looked around at the faces surrounding him, seeing in them a unity of purpose that he had tried to undermine but had ultimately failed to destroy. "Because watching you people work together this week, seeing what you've accomplished, it's made me realize that I've been on the wrong side of something important." He gestured toward the barn, its walls solid and true, its roof ready to shelter the community's livestock through the harsh winter ahead. "This isn't just about building a barn. It's about proving that we can still come together when it matters, that we can still accomplish things that seem impossible if we're willing to work for them." The wind chose that moment to pick up, stirring the flag that hung above the work site and carrying with it the scent of rain and the promise of the storm that was approaching from the west. In the distance, thunder rumbled like the sound of armies on the march, and everyone understood that time was running out. "Jake," Zeke said, his voice calm but his eyes intent, "if you're serious about helping, we could use every hand we can get. This storm's going to be here soon, and we still have work to finish." Jake Morrison looked around at the crew that had labored for 7 days to accomplish something he had declared impossible, seeing in their faces the kind of determination that had built nations and carved civilization from wilderness. Without a word, he rolled up his sleeves and picked up a hammer. "Tell me what needs doing," he said simply. As the morning progressed toward what promised to be a dramatic afternoon, the barn stood nearly complete, a testament to what could be accomplished when people set aside their differences and worked toward a common goal. The storm was coming, dark and threatening on the western horizon, but for the first time in 7 days, the entire community was united in their determination to see the project through to completion. The flag snapped in the rising wind, its colors bright against the darkening sky, a reminder that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the odds. And in the distance, the thunder grew louder, as if the very heavens were preparing to test the strength of what human hands had built. The first drops of rain began to fall just as the crew was making the final adjustments to the barn doors, each drop hitting the dust with the soft percussion that promised a deluge to follow. From his pocket, Zeke Carter withdrew a golden horseshoe, worn smooth by decades of handling and polished to a warm shine that seemed to glow even in the grey light of the approaching storm. The horseshoe had belonged to his prize mare, Stella, and had been her good luck charm through countless miles of frontier travel. Now it would serve as the symbolic finishing touch on a project that had required more than its share of good fortune. The wind was picking up steadily, causing the American flag to snap and flutter with increasing urgency, its fabric straining against the rope that held it aloft. Lightning flickered in the distance, still far enough away that the thunder took several seconds to reach them, but close enough that everyone understood they were working against time that was running out fast. "How much more?" Pete Henley called out, his voice raised to carry over the increasing wind. He was working with Samuel Creek to install the final piece of hardware on the barn doors, a complex mechanism that would allow the massive structures to slide smoothly, open and closed. 20 minutes, maybe 30, Zeke replied, checking the alignment of the doors one more time. But that's if everything goes perfectly. Tommy Morrison was on the roof, securing the last few loose shingles that could become dangerous projectiles if the wind got under them. At 16, he had developed the sure-footedness of someone who had grown up climbing and working at heights, but even he was beginning to feel nervous about the conditions. "Zeke," he called down, "this wind is getting stronger. Maybe we should think about taking shelter." "Not yet, son," Zeke replied, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had worked in dangerous conditions before. "We're too close to stop now." Sarah Mitchell was inside the barn, organizing the tools and materials that would need to be secured before the storm hit in earnest. She had taken on the role of logistics coordinator almost without thinking about it, her natural organizational abilities proving invaluable in keeping track of all the details that could be overlooked in the rush to finish. Jake Morrison worked alongside Billy Patterson to install the final interior bracing, his movements awkward at first, as he tried to match the rhythm that the regular crew had developed over the course of the week. But he was a quick learner, and his determination to contribute meaningfully to the effort was evident in every hammer blow. "I still can't believe you're the bridge builder Zeke," Billy said, pausing in his work to study the man who had become something of a legend. "My grandfather used to tell stories about the spans you built, said they were engineering marvels that opened up the whole Western Territory." Zeke continued his work without looking up, but his voice carried a warmth that hadn't been there when discussing his past earlier in the week. "Your grandfather was a generous man with his praise. Those bridges were team efforts, built by crews of skilled workers who knew their trade." "But you designed them," Jake pointed out. "You figured out how to span distances that other engineers said were impossible." "I had good teachers and better workers," Zeke replied modestly, "and I learned that the secret to building anything that lasts is to respect the forces you're working against." As if to emphasize his point, a particularly strong gust of wind struck the barn, causing the entire structure to shudder slightly. But instead of the creaking and groaning that might have been expected from a hastily constructed building, the barn responded with the solid stability of something built to last. "That's some serious wind," Pete observed, "but this barn isn't budging. You built this thing like it was designed to withstand a hurricane." "Prairie storms can be as destructive as hurricanes," Zeke replied, tapping the golden horseshoe against his palm. "The secret is to build for the worst conditions you can imagine, then add a margin of safety on top of that." The rain was falling harder now, driven by wind that was approaching dangerous velocity. Lightning was becoming more frequent, and the thunder was following more closely, indicating that the heart of the storm was rapidly approaching their location. It was then that disaster nearly struck. Tommy, working to secure a loose piece of roofing material, lost his footing on the wet shingles and began to slide toward the edge of the roof. For a heart-stopping moment, it looked as though he would fall 20 feet to the hard ground below. but his quick reflexes and the safety rope that Pete had insisted everyone wear saved him from serious injury. "That's it," Zeke called out, his voice cutting through the wind and rain. "Everyone off the roof. We'll have to finish what we can from ground level." Tommy climbed down carefully, his face pale but his spirit unshaken. "I'm sorry, Zeke. I know we're so close." "You did good, son," Zeke interrupted. "No project is worth getting hurt over. We'll make do with what we can accomplish safely." But even as he spoke, Zeke's eyes were calculating the work that remained and the time they had left. The barn was essentially complete, structurally sound, weatherproof and functional. But there were still details that needed attention, finishing touches that would transform it from merely adequate to truly excellent. The golden horseshoe seemed to grow warmer in his hand as he made his decision. "Sarah, Pete, Jake, I need you to help me with the final details inside the barn. Tommy, Billy, Samuel start securing everything outside that could become a projectile. We've got maybe 10 minutes before this storm hits with full force." The crew scattered to their assigned tasks with the efficiency of people who had learned to work together under pressure. Inside the barn, the final installation work proceeded rapidly, with each person contributing their expertise to ensure that every component was properly secured and functional. Outside, the younger members of the crew worked frantically to batten down anything that could be torn loose by the wind. Tools were secured, loose lumber was weighted down or moved inside, and the work area was cleared of potential hazards. The American flag was now whipping violently in the wind, its fabric stretched to the breaking point by the forces acting upon it. Lightning was striking with increasing frequency, and the thunder was becoming a constant rumble that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. "That's the best we can do," Zeke announced, stepping back to survey their work. The barn stood complete and solid, its walls straight and true, its roof secured against the storm, its massive doors hanging perfectly in their frames. It was a structure that would serve the community for generations, built to standards that exceeded anything that had been expected when the project began. As the crew gathered inside the barn for shelter, the full force of the storm finally arrived. Wind that had been strong became violent, rain that had been heavy became torrential, and lightning that had been distant became immediate and dangerous. But inside the barn, protected by walls they had built with their own hands, the crew felt safe and proud of what they had accomplished. Jake Morrison stood near the center of the barn, looking around at the solid construction with something approaching awe. "I have to admit," he said, raising his voice to be heard over the storm, "this is not what I expected when this week started." "None of us expected this," Sarah replied, gesturing not just at the barn but at the sense of community that had developed among people who had barely known each other a week earlier. Zeke hung the golden horseshoe on a nail beside the barn doors, its polished surface catching the occasional flash of lightning that penetrated the darkness outside. "Sometimes the best things are the ones we don't expect," he said simply. "Sometimes the greatest accomplishments come from taking on challenges that seem impossible." Outside, the storm raged with the full fury of the prairie unleashed. But inside the barn that had been built in 7 days by a community working together, there was warmth and safety and the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you have done something extraordinary. The storm reached its full fury, just as the sun should have been setting, but the sky was so dark with roiling clouds that it might have been midnight. Inside the barn, the crew huddled together while wind-driven rain hammered against the walls they had built, testing every joint and challenging every decision they had made over the course of 7 intense days. In his hands, Zeke Carter held a piece of wood that would serve as the final element of their projector, handmade plaque, bearing the names of everyone who had contributed to the barn's construction. He had carved the plaque during the quiet moments between major construction tasks, working by lamplight in the early mornings before the crew arrived. Each name had been inscribed with the care due to someone who had given their time and effort to a cause larger than themselves. Tommy Morrison, who had grown from a ranch hand into a leader. Pete Henley, whose military experience had provided the organizational backbone for their efforts, Sarah Mitchell, whose quiet strength had held the community together, Billy Patterson and Samuel Creek, whose skills had proved invaluable. Even Jake Morrison's name was there, carved before his conversion, but left in place as a testament to the possibility of redemption. "Listen to that wind," Tommy said, his voice filled with awe rather than fear. "It sounds like a freight train. Winds like this can reach 80, maybe 90 miles per hour." Pete observed, his military training making him naturally attentive to tactical conditions. Strong enough to flatten most buildings. But the barn they sheltered in showed no signs of stress. The walls stood solid and true, the roof remained secure, and the massive doors hung perfectly in their frames, despite the tremendous pressure being exerted by the wind. Every joint held, every connection remained tight, and every beam bore its load exactly as Zeke had designed it to do. "You know what this means, don't you?" Sarah said, her voice carrying a mixture of wonder and satisfaction. "We actually did it. We built a barn in 7 days that's strong enough to withstand a major storm." Jake Morrison shook his head in amazement. "When you made that promise a week ago, I thought you were either crazy or delusional. I never imagined that you could actually pull it off." "We pulled it off," Zeke corrected gently. "This barn exists because a whole community decided to believe in something and work for it." A particularly violent gust of wind struck the barn, causing everyone to tense momentarily, but the structure absorbed the blow without even a creak of protest. The engineering was sound, the construction was solid, and the building was performing exactly as it had been designed to do. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier," Jake continued, "about proving what this community believes in. I think I understand now what you were really trying to accomplish." "And what's that?" Zeke asked, though his eyes suggested he already knew the answer. "You weren't just building a barn," Jake replied. "You were building confidence. You were proving that we can still tackle big challenges, that we can still come together when it matters, that we don't have to accept limitations just because other people tell us they exist." Billy Patterson nodded in agreement. "My father always said that the difference between successful people and unsuccessful people isn't talent or luck, it's the willingness to try things that might not work." "Your father was a wise man," Zeke observed. "Most people spend so much time calculating the odds of failure that they never discover what's actually possible." Outside, the lightning was flashing almost continuously now, illuminating the barn's interior with stroboscopic bursts of brilliant white light. But instead of the harsh glare that revealed flaws and imperfections, the lightning seemed to highlight the quality of the construction, the precision of the joinery, the solid craftsmanship that had gone into every detail. Samuel Creek walked over to examine one of the wall joints more closely, running his fingers along the connection with the appreciation of someone who understood fine carpentry. "You know, I've been working with wood since I was 12, but I learned more this week than in all the years before." "What did you learn?" Sarah asked. "That there's a difference between building something and building it right," Samuel replied. "That taking the time to do quality work isn't slower in the long run, it's faster, because you don't have to fix mistakes or rebuild things that fall down." Tommy had been quiet for several minutes, lost in thought as he listened to the storm rage outside. Finally, he spoke up with the kind of insight that sometimes comes to young people before experience teaches them to be cautious. "I think this week changed all of us," he said. "Not just because we built something together, but because we discovered capabilities we didn't know we had." "How so?" Pete asked, interested in the boy's perspective. "Well, I learned that I can lead people, that I can organize complex projects and get them done on schedule. Sarah learned that she has engineering instincts that rival any trained professional. Jake learned that he was wrong about what's possible when people work together." He paused, looking around at the faces surrounding him. "But mostly, I think we learned that age and experience aren't limitations, they're advantages, if you know how to use them properly." Zeke felt something shift inside him as he listened to Tommy's words, a loosening of tension that he had been carrying for 20 years. The boy was right this week, had been about more than building a barn. It had been about proving that people could still accomplish extraordinary things if they were willing to commit themselves fully to the effort. The storm seemed to be reaching its peak now, with wind that sounded like the roar of a dozen locomotives and rain that struck the walls with the force of thrown gravel. But inside the barn, surrounded by people who had become friends and colleagues through shared effort, Zeke felt a peace that he hadn't experienced since before the tragedy in Denver. "I have something for all of you," he said, producing the wooden plaque from his tool bag, "a way to remember what we accomplished here." He held up the plaque so everyone could see the carefully carved names, each one representing someone who had contributed their time, skill, and energy to making the impossible possible. The wood was smooth and polished, ready to hang in a place of honor where future generations could see the record of what their predecessors had achieved. "Where should we put it?" Sarah asked. Zeke looked around the barn, considering various locations before settling on the perfect spot. "Right there," he said, pointing to a beam beside the main doors, "where everyone who enters will see it, and remember that this barn was built by people who refused to accept that something couldn't be done." As he hammered the plaque into place, each blow of the hammer seemed to drive home, not just the nail, but the significance of what they had accomplished. This barn would shelter livestock through harsh winters, provide space for community gatherings, and serve as a reminder that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when they worked together toward a common goal. The storm was beginning to show signs of abating, the intervals between lightning flashes growing longer and the thunder becoming more distant. But even as the immediate danger passed, everyone understood that they had weathered more than just a meteorological event. They had survived the test of their own abilities, proven their worth to themselves and each other, and emerged stronger than they had been before. "You know what the best part is?" Jake Morrison said, his voice filled with genuine satisfaction. "Tomorrow morning, when people see this barn standing solid and complete, they're going to understand that anything is possible if you're willing to work for it." Zeke nodded, his hand moving instinctively to the pocket watch in his vest. For the first time in 20 years, he found himself wondering what time it really was, and whether it might finally be time to let the past go and embrace whatever future awaited them all. Outside, the storm was moving eastward, carrying with it the last of the rain and wind that had tested their construction. Inside the barn they had built together, the golden horseshoe gleamed in the fading light, a symbol of the good fortune that comes to those who dare to believe in themselves and the power of community working toward a common purpose. The morning after the storm dawned with the kind of crystalline clarity that follows the passage of violent weather, as if the world had been washed clean and polished to a bright shine. Zeke Carter stood in the doorway of the completed barn, holding in his weathered hands a hand-forged iron key, black with age but solid and functional. The key had been the final detail, crafted during the quiet hours before dawn, while the rest of the town still slept, unaware that history had been made in their midst. The key was more than just a practical tool, it was a symbol of trust, of the responsibility that came with caring for something that belonged to the entire community. Soon he would present it to Mayor Thompson in a simple ceremony that would mark not just the completion of a building project, but the transformation of a town's understanding of what was possible when people worked together. The morning after the storm dawned with the kind of crystalline clarity that follows the passage of violent weather, as if the world had been washed clean and polished to a bright shine. Zeke Carter stood in the doorway of the completed barn, holding in his weathered hands a hand-forged iron key, black with age but solid and functional. The key had been the final detail, crafted during the quiet hours before dawn, while the rest of the town still slept, unaware that history had been made in their midst. The key was more than just a practical tool, it was a symbol of trust, of the responsibility that came with caring for something that belonged to the entire community. Soon he would present it to Mayor Thompson in a simple ceremony that would mark not just the completion of a building project, but the transformation of a town's understanding of what was possible when people worked together. Behind him, the barn stood exactly as he had envisioned it 7 days earlier, its walls straight and true, its roof solid against the sky, its massive doors hanging perfectly in their frames. The storm had tested every joint and challenged every decision, but the structure had emerged unscathed, proof that quality work could withstand whatever forces nature chose to unleash. The sound of approaching footsteps drew his attention to the road, where a small crowd was gathering to witness what many had believed would be impossible. Tommy Morrison led the group, his young face beaming with the pride of someone who had discovered capabilities he never knew he possessed. Behind him came Sarah Mitchell, Pete Henley, Billy Patterson, and Samuel Creek, the core team that had made the miracle possible through 7 days of dedicated work. Even Jake Morrison was there, his face no longer showing the skepticism that had characterized his attitude at the beginning of the week. The storm had washed away more than dust and debris. It had cleansed the air of doubt and opposition, leaving behind a community united in appreciation for what had been accomplished. "Morning, Zeke," Tommy called out, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had proven himself under pressure. "How did she hold up?" "Like she was built to last 100 years, Zeke replied, patting the door frame with obvious satisfaction. "Not so much as a loose shingle." Mayor Thompson arrived with the formal ceremony that the occasion demanded, carrying a scroll that would serve as the official deed transferring ownership of the barn from its builder to the community it would serve. "Ezekiel Carter," he began, his voice carrying across the gathering crowd, "on behalf of the people of Millbrook, Kansas, I want to thank you for accomplishing something that will benefit our community for generations to come." Zeke accepted the scroll with the quiet dignity that had characterized his approach to the entire project. "Mayor Thompson, the thanks belong to everyone who contributed to this effort. This barn exists because a whole community decided to believe in something and work for it." He turned to address the crowd directly, his weathered face reflecting the satisfaction of a man who had rediscovered his purpose after 20 years of uncertainty. 7 days ago, I made a promise that seemed impossible to most people. Today, we're standing in the proof that impossible is just a word we use when we're not willing to do the work." Sarah stepped forward, her eyes bright with tears of satisfaction. "Mr. Carter, this week has shown us all what we're capable of when we work together. You didn't just build us a barn, you rebuilt our faith in ourselves." The ceremony concluded with Zeke presenting the iron key to Mayor Thompson, a gesture that symbolized the transition from individual achievement to community ownership. The key would hang on a hook beside the barn doors, available to anyone who needed access to the building for legitimate purposes, a tangible reminder that some things belong to everyone and were strengthened by shared responsibility. As the crowd began to disperse, people returned to their daily routines with a sense of renewed purpose and possibility. The barn would shelter livestock through the coming winter, provide space for community gatherings, and serve as a permanent reminder that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they committed themselves fully to a common goal. Tommy lingered behind as the others left, clearly wanting to say something but struggling to find the right words. Finally, he spoke with the earnestness that had made him such an effective leader during the construction project. "Zeke, this week changed my life. I learned things about myself that I never would have discovered otherwise. I want to keep learning, keep building, keep proving that age and experience are advantages rather than limitations." Zeke smiled, recognizing in the boy's words an echo of his own youthful ambitions. "Son, you've got natural leadership abilities and a good instinct for construction work. If you're serious about learning, I'd be honored to teach you what I know." The offer was more than Tommy had dared to hope for, and his face lit up with the kind of joy that comes from unexpected opportunity. "You mean it? You'd really take me on as an apprentice?" "I mean it," Zeke confirmed, "but understand that learning to be a master builder takes years of dedicated work. There are no shortcuts to genuine expertise." "I understand," Tommy replied, his voice steady with determination. "I'm ready to put in the work." Pete Henley approached as Tommy headed home to share the news with his family. The old soldier's face was thoughtful, as if he had been considering something important and had finally reached a decision. "Zeke, I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about age and experience being advantages. I've got some ideas for other projects that could benefit the community. A new school, maybe some improvements to the church, possibly even a bridge over Miller's Creek. Zeke studied Pete's face, seeing in it the same enthusiasm that had driven their barn-raising effort. Sounds like you're thinking about forming a regular construction crew. That's exactly what I'm thinking, Pete confirmed. We've proven that we can tackle big projects when we work together. Why should we stop with one barn? The idea was appealing, offering the possibility of using their newfound skills and confidence to address other community needs. More than that, it provided a way to preserve and pass on the knowledge and experience that had made their success possible. I like the idea, Zeke said, but let's give ourselves time to savor this accomplishment before we start planning the next one. As the afternoon wore on, Zeke found himself alone with Sarah, walking slowly around the barn and admiring the quality of the work they had accomplished together. The building was more than just functional, it was beautiful, with clean lines and careful proportions that spoke of pride in craftsmanship. "I have something to tell you," Sarah said, her voice carrying a mixture of nervousness and determination. "These past 7 days, working alongside you, watching you lead and inspire people, it's made me realize something important." She paused, seeming to gather her courage before continuing. "I think I'm falling in love with you, Ezekiel Carter. Not with the legend of bridge builder Zeke, but with the man who had the courage to take on an impossible challenge and see it through to completion." The words hung in the air between them like music, beautiful and surprising and full of promise. Zeke felt something shift inside him, a loosening of the bonds that had held him prisoner to his past for 20 years. "Sarah," he said softly, "I think I've been falling in love with you too. You have a strength and wisdom that complements my experience, a way of seeing possibilities that I had forgotten existed." He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew the silver pocket watch that had been stopped for 2 decades. With deliberate care, he wound the mechanism and watched as the hands began to move, marking time that was finally moving forward again. "I think it's time to let the past be the past," he said, "and start building a future that's worth looking forward to." As the sun set behind the western hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, the barn stood silhouetted against the horizon, like a monument to the power of human determination. Inside, cattle would soon find shelter from winter storms. The loft would store hay to feed the community's livestock through the harsh months ahead. And on the beam beside the main doors, a wooden plaque would remind future generations that their predecessors had refused to accept limitations and had chosen instead to prove that anything was possible when people worked together toward a common goal. The golden horseshoe gleamed in the fading light, a symbol of the good fortune that comes to those who dare to believe in themselves and in the transformative power of community. And in the distance, the sound of a train whistle carried across the prairie, a reminder that the world was full of connections waiting to be made and bridges waiting to be built by those with the courage to try. 7 days earlier, they had mocked when the 106-year-old cowboy promised a barn in 7 days. Now they stood silent, not in defeat but in awe, understanding that they had witnessed something extraordinary, the birth of a legend, and the renewal of a community's faith in its own capabilities. The barn would stand for generations, but the memory of how it came to be would last even longer, passed down as a story of what becomes possible when people choose hope over doubt, action over inaction, and unity over division. In his pocket, Zeke's watch ticked steadily forward, marking time that was no longer suspended, but flowing toward a future full of promise and possibility.